there is a quieter voice within you that does not compete for attention, which is why it often remains just outside what you immediately notice. When the mind fills with thoughts that feel urgent or necessary, that quieter presence does not try to match the intensity, and instead continues in a steady way that can easily be passed over. It tends to appear in brief moments, often just before a decision settles, carrying a slight hesitation or a subtle shift in feeling that is easy to move past without fully recognizing. As attention becomes more familiar with movement than stillness, what feels active and defined begins to take priority, while quieter signals receive less reinforcement and gradually fade into the background. Nothing is actually lost during this process, yet what once felt instinctive can begin to feel uncertain, simply because it is no longer the primary thing being listened to. At the same time, repeated patterns start to feel more reliable, not because they are more aligned, but because familiarity gives them a sense of stability that does not require further attention. Even when something within you does not fully match those patterns, the misalignment rarely interrupts what you are doing, and instead remains as a subtle tension beneath the surface. It can feel as though everything is functioning as it should, while at the same time there is a quiet sense that something is being adjusted rather than naturally expressed. Familiar patterns tend to feel safer, not because they are always aligned with what you truly feel, but because they reduce the need to pause and question what has already become known. When something has been repeated enough times, it begins to carry a sense of reliability that allows the mind to move forward without examining each step too closely, creating a quiet sense of continuity that feels stable on the surface. This kind of stability can make it easier to continue without interruption, even when your actions do not fully reflect what is happening internally, because nothing immediately signals that something is slightly misaligned or worth slowing down for. In contrast, the quieter voice does not offer that same immediacy, and instead requires a brief moment of attention that can feel unnecessary when everything appears to be functioning as expected. Because of this, the mind often leans toward what is structured and predictable, choosing what maintains movement rather than what invites a deeper kind of noticing that might interrupt the flow. Over time, this preference reinforces itself as familiar patterns become easier to follow, while anything less repeated begins to feel less certain, even when it carries a more genuine sense of alignment beneath the surface. What forms from this is not a deliberate choice to ignore what you feel, but a gradual shift toward what allows you to keep going without needing to slow down enough to notice the difference. As these familiar patterns continue, they begin to feel less like something you are choosing and more like something that simply reflects who you are. Repetition has a way of shaping perception, and over time, what is repeated most often can start to define what feels natural, even when it was not originally a conscious expression of yourself. This shift happens quietly, without a clear moment of transition, making it difficult to notice when a pattern stops being a response and starts becoming part of your identity. What was once a way of adapting to situations gradually settles into something that feels consistent, and consistency can easily be mistaken for authenticity when it is experienced often enough. Because of this, the quieter voice can begin to feel less familiar, not because it has changed, but because it has not been reinforced in the same way as the patterns that now feel more established. A sense of self can form around what is repeated, rather than what is deeply felt, creating a subtle difference between what feels natural and what feels true beneath the surface. This difference is not always obvious, and it rarely creates enough tension to be questioned directly, allowing the pattern to continue without interruption. Over time, the distinction between habit and identity becomes less clear, making it easier to move through life in ways that feel consistent, yet slightly removed from something quieter within. Because this shift happens gradually, it rarely feels like something that needs attention, allowing it to continue without creating a clear sense of discomfort. Nothing feels urgent enough to question, and without urgency, there is little reason to pause and look more closely at what is happening beneath the surface. What forms instead is a quiet kind of adaptation, where everything continues to function in a way that appears stable, even when something within you feels slightly out of place. This sense of misalignment does not present itself as a strong signal, and instead remains subtle enough to be interpreted as something normal or expected. Over time, this subtle tension can become familiar, and once something becomes familiar, it often stops being noticed as something separate from your usual experience. Because of this, the absence of discomfort does not always mean that everything is fully aligned, and the presence of stability does not always reflect a deeper sense of ease. It simply reflects what has been maintained long enough to feel normal, even when that normal includes a quiet distance that is difficult to define. Without a clear interruption, there is nothing that forces attention back inward, allowing the pattern to continue in a way that feels smooth yet slightly disconnected beneath the surface. When something subtle is experienced repeatedly, it can begin to feel like a natural part of your baseline, rather than something that stands out as different. The slight distance that once felt unfamiliar gradually settles into the background, no longer drawing attention because it has been present long enough to feel ordinary. What might have once been noticed as a small misalignment becomes integrated into your day-to-day experience, making it harder to recognize that anything has shifted at all. This process does not require conscious agreement, and it does not depend on clear awareness, because normalization happens through repetition rather than deliberate choice. As a result, what you experience most consistently begins to define what feels normal, even when that normal includes a quiet reduction in how fully you feel connected to yourself. There is no clear marker that signals when this change has taken place, which allows it to continue without interruption, blending into the overall sense of how things usually are. Because of this, the absence of something deeper is not always recognized as absence, and instead can feel like a stable and acceptable version of your current state. Over time, the idea of feeling more connected may begin to seem distant or unnecessary, not because it lacks value, but because it has not been experienced recently enough to feel immediate. Once a pattern has settled into what feels normal, it tends to continue without requiring much effort, allowing it to move forward on its own momentum. There is no clear point where you decide to keep going in the same way, yet the continuation happens naturally because stopping would require a kind of attention that feels unfamiliar. Momentum forms quietly, built from repeated choices that no longer feel like choices, creating a flow that carries you forward without needing to be actively directed. Within this flow, there is little reason to pause, since everything appears to be functioning in a way that feels consistent and stable enough to maintain. The absence of friction can make the experience feel smooth, even when that smoothness is shaped by patterns that are no longer being questioned. Because of this, movement itself can begin to feel like confirmation that everything is aligned, when in reality, it may simply reflect that nothing has interrupted the current direction. Slowing down, even slightly, can begin to feel unnecessary or even uncomfortable, not because something is wrong, but because the system has adapted to continuous motion. As long as the movement continues, there is little space for something quieter to be noticed, allowing the same patterns to sustain themselves without needing to be examined. When movement has been continuous for a long time, stillness can begin to feel unfamiliar, not because something is wrong, but because it is no longer what the mind is used to experiencing. Without the usual flow of thoughts and actions, there can be a subtle sense that something is missing, even when nothing actually needs to be added or changed. The absence of activity does not immediately register as rest, and instead can feel slightly incomplete, as if the space needs to be filled in order to feel normal again. This response forms gradually, shaped by repetition, where constant engagement becomes the default state, and anything outside of it begins to feel less natural. Because of this, slowing down can create a quiet discomfort that is difficult to explain, not strong enough to demand attention, yet present enough to make stillness feel less inviting. The mind may reach for something to continue, not out of urgency, but out of familiarity, returning to patterns that feel easier to recognize and maintain. In this way, movement continues not because it is necessary, but because it has become what feels most stable, even when it limits the space where something quieter could be noticed. Allowing that space to remain open requires a different kind of attention, one that does not rush to fill what feels empty, but instead stays long enough for something subtle to emerge. When space is allowed to remain, even for a short time, something subtle can begin to return, not as a sudden realization, but as a quiet shift in what becomes noticeable. Without the usual need to fill every moment, attention starts to settle in a different way, making it possible to sense what was previously overlooked. This is not a dramatic change, and it does not arrive with clarity or strong emotion, but rather as a gentle awareness that something is present beneath the surface. The quieter voice does not need to become louder to be heard, and instead becomes clearer as the surrounding noise softens and the pace of attention slows. What emerges is often familiar, though it may not feel immediately recognizable, because it has not been part of your recent experience in a consistent way. There can be a sense of reconnecting with something that was never actually lost, only moved out of focus by the patterns that occupied more of your attention. This process does not require effort in the usual sense, and instead depends on allowing space to remain open without rushing to define or interpret what appears. As this continues, the difference between what feels natural and what feels true may begin to surface more clearly, not as a conclusion but as something quietly felt within. As this quieter awareness begins to surface again, there can be a gradual shift in how it is experienced, not as something uncertain, but as something that feels quietly consistent. What was once easy to overlook may begin to carry a different kind of presence, not stronger in volume, but steadier in how it stays with you. This steadiness can make it easier to recognize, not through effort, but through repeated noticing that does not feel forced or deliberate. Trust does not return all at once, and instead builds in small moments where what you sense internally begins to match what you allow yourself to acknowledge. Each time this alignment is noticed, it becomes slightly more familiar, not in the way patterns repeat, but in the way something true continues to feel the same over time. There is no need to confirm it through logic, and no need to explain it in order to make it valid, because its consistency becomes enough to recognize it as something reliable. This kind of trust forms quietly, without needing to replace anything immediately, and without requiring a sudden change in how you move through your life. Over time, what once felt distant can begin to feel closer again, not because it has changed, but because you are no longer moving past it in the same way as before. As this quiet sense of trust becomes more familiar, it can begin to influence your decisions in ways that are not immediately obvious. Changes do not happen all at once, and instead appear in small shifts where certain choices begin to feel slightly different from before. Something that once felt easy to agree to may now carry a subtle hesitation, while something that once felt uncertain may begin to feel quietly steady. These changes do not demand action, and they do not create pressure to respond, but they introduce a different kind of awareness that stays present as you move forward. Rather than replacing your usual way of thinking, this quieter influence exists alongside it, offering a sense of direction that does not rely on urgency or force. Because of this, decisions can begin to feel less like reactions and more like something that is unfolding from a place that is more internally aligned. There is no need to explain these shifts or turn them into clear conclusions, since their value comes from how consistently they are felt, rather than how clearly they are defined. Over time, even small moments of alignment can begin to change the overall direction you move in, not through sudden change, but through a steady adjustment that becomes easier to recognize. As these small shifts continue, they can begin to influence your overall direction in ways that are difficult to notice in the moment. There is no single point where everything changes, and instead, the movement happens gradually, shaped by repeated moments of quiet alignment. What once felt automatic may begin to feel less certain, while something more subtle starts to guide your attention in ways that feel steady rather than urgent. This does not create a sudden transformation, and it does not require you to leave behind what has been familiar, but it introduces a different sense of movement that unfolds over time. Because the change is not dramatic, it can remain almost invisible, even as it slowly reshapes how you respond to situations and how you choose to continue forward. Each moment of alignment may seem small on its own, yet over time, these moments begin to accumulate, creating a shift that is felt more in direction than in intensity. What changes is not only what you do, but how it feels to move through what you do as the sense of distance gradually softens without needing to be forced. In this way, the path you are on can begin to adjust quietly, not through sudden decisions, but through a series of subtle movements that feel more connected to something within. As this quieter sense becomes more present, there can be a gradual recognition that nothing new has been created, and nothing needed to be found somewhere else. What you begin to notice may feel familiar in a way that is difficult to explain, not because it has recently appeared, but because it has always been there, waiting without interruption. The sense of distance that once felt unclear can begin to soften, not through effort, but through a shift in how you are relating to what has always existed within you. There is no need to fully understand it, and no need to define it in precise terms, because its presence does not depend on explanation in order to be valid. What changes is not the voice itself, but your willingness to remain with it long enough for it to be felt more clearly. In that space, there is nothing to correct and nothing to force into place, only a quiet recognition that you have not been separate from it, even when it felt distant. This realization does not arrive as a conclusion, and it does not close anything off, but instead leaves things open in a way that feels steady and complete at the same time. From here, there is no pressure to move differently, only the possibility of continuing in a way that feels slightly more connected than before.